Welcome to Doing, Being, Thinking, dialectical behavior therapy skills for making a life worth living. I'm your host, Eric Nykamp, a therapist and clinical director at the Grand Rapids campus of Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services, a mental health practice with campuses throughout the great state of Michigan. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Doing, Being, Thinking, a podcast exploring the what, when, and how of using dialectical behavior therapy skills for making a life worth living. My name's Eric. I'm a DBT therapist and one of the clinical directors at Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about observing and describing. And joining me today is my friend Nate Knapp, one of the other therapists here at Adolescent Families, one of our telehealth therapists. How are you doing this morning?
Eric, doing well. Thank you for having me this morning.
Yeah, this should be pretty fun. So let's start off today by just talking about what is observing and describing.
Observing and describing is part of the mindfulness skill set that we teach in terms of DBT. Is part of the group of what they call the mindfulness what skills. And those are the skills that also include observe, describe, and also participating. Obviously, today we're just going to go over observe and describe. Observing and describing are pretty self-explanatory, like on the surface. What skills are kind of what we do when we're practicing mindfulness, sort of like that action phase, sort of like the thing we're doing. But what's interesting with those skills is that we do those things one at a time. We're not doing them simultaneously. We're not multitasking. We're doing, if we're going to observe, we're going to observe. If we're going to describe, we're going to describe. So we're going to do all those things collectively by the end, but in the moment, we're only doing one of them at a time.
Why would somebody want to use these skills?
When I think about that, I think of like if we're feeling some type of emotion dysregulation of ourselves, maybe there's a conflict between us and somebody else. Maybe we're experiencing just some stress and anxiety. And, those things can really feel out of balance. And so sometimes we forget to observe and describe what we're doing kind of in the moment if those things are going on around us.
Yeah. So when would you want to use this skill? I mean, when do you use it, or when do you hear clients talk about using it?
One of the biggest things I hear, especially one, as I said, if they're feeling dysregulated, if they're feeling conflict, as I mentioned, a lot of times it's when people tell me when things aren't going according to plan. Like they've had a plan kind of set, things start to happen, it doesn't go the way they want. Then we see kind of that emotion dysregulation, the stress, the anxiety, some of those behaviors start to kind of activate. And that can lead us to feeling pretty overwhelmed in the moment. And that's when things like maybe we respond out of emotion mind or things like that start to happen. A couple examples that I can think of, a couple of everyday ones I think of, like observing and describing. Going to the zoo or the museum for doing fun things. So if we go to the zoo and the museum, we can just say we went. But people might go, well, what did you see? What was there? And so sometimes we might then say, if we go to the zoo, oh, I went to the zoo. I saw the monkeys, the bears, the elephants. Then we get this picture of what was actually there, what they actually saw. And the biggest, and I think one of the coolest, most unique things about observe and describe is we do it through our five senses. Mm-hmm. And one of the really cool and interesting things about that is, we should be able to observe and describe it through our five senses so that other people can understand it as well. So it gives them this picture, this idea of what they're experiencing. The trick is if we can't experience it through our five senses, we can almost even kind of say, if we can't describe it that way, then it possibly didn't happen.
Yeah. I'm thinking... But one of the last times that I used this, I had a hard thing in my life that I needed to talk to somebody about. And I'm one of these people where my feelings get really strong
Mhm.
And so it can be really difficult sometimes in those moments to organize, to figure out how do you do something effectively where you feel like I don't want to blow it when I share this thing that's on my heart or when I talk about how something impacted me. Because it's very easy to express yourself in a way that can be overwhelming to someone else. And I've gotten plenty of feedback over my whole lifetime. I'm like 50 years old. I've got a catalog of my own mistakes. Right? I don't know if you have that.
I'm not too far behind from Eric. Being 45, it's like I've gotten
Okay.
quite a lot of my own, and you're kind of hitting on something too that I also kind of made a note of is arguments and conflicts are kind of
Yeah.
areas that could really use this skill, especially if I'm misinterpreting something or maybe I'm communicating something out that isn't completely making sense to that other person.
I totally agree. I was talking with someone yesterday and they were talking about how to improve communication in their marriage. And we were just talking about, well, do you think that your spouse knows what's going on inside of you when this thing happens that's your regular argument? They sat back and they're like, I don't know. Well, these are the skills in some ways. It's like, well, let's kind of imagine it again.
Mhm.
And as you're imagining it, write down like what do you notice happening inside of you? What thoughts do you notice? What does your body feel like? What do your muscles feel like? Like where do you feel tension? This kind of thing. And those reflective activities, I think, in some ways, get us back out of our head and into reality. Because sometimes when we're really feeling our emotions, it's like we get lost in our head and we're disconnected and we can think about how awful it's going to be. It's always been bad. It's bad right now and it's going to get worse.
Certainly. And, I'll have clients come in kind of dysregulated. And one of the first questions I'll ask them is, well, what are you feeling right now? And
Yeah.
sometimes I'll even add what time of day it is, the date of what we're doing. Like if it's like today, May 2nd at like 9:15 a.m., it'd be like, well, how are you feeling at that very moment right now?
Yeah.
And sometimes
Yeah.
just to get them into that moment, I think the other dangerous path too that it gets, especially like in a relationship, is if we don't observe and describe sometimes in those moments, it can leave that other person in a spot where they have to assume a lot of things.
Yeah. And we know where assuming is going to end up.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
do you ever notice though that when people are feeling their emotions really intensely, that the emotion really steers the assumptions one way or the other?
Yes,
Like
very
on
much.
days where everything's going great, it's easy to assume that, like, oh, this is painful, but not such a big deal. But on days where you're feeling like depressed or anxious or something, like a little thing can feel like this signifier for this calamity that's coming. And it's very easy to react with more intensity than really fits the situation. Well, if you were walking a client or a friend through how to use this skill, how would you say to go about doing that?
So if I'm kind of talking to them about just simply observing, so I'll kind of start with that. I want them to kind of notice a few things. I want them to notice your body sensations. I want you to
Hmm.
pay attention on purpose to be very present focused. And you want to control that attention kind of using your five senses. Again, we kind of go through that. We want to describe through there, that or not describe, observe through those five senses. Um, you want to control your attention, but not necessarily what you see. You want to just kind of practice some wordless watching. You're observing both inside and outside of yourself. And part of what you want to do is one, go back to your senses. Those can be such a great guide in the moment, and they're going to tell us so much information. We want to have an open mind. We want to be able to open our mind up, and we want to be able to focus our mind as well. And so when we're observing, we want to be able to do those things. Now, when it comes to describing, I kind of look at it this way. We observe our five senses to sort of gather the information in our environment. Describing is that way of saying, okay, tell me everything that you just experienced through your senses. Put it into words, and label what you saw. Any, interpretations or opinions, notice that they're there. But you want to remember, and this is kind of a point I mentioned earlier, that if you can't observe it through your senses, then we can't describe it.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever notice that something happens when people use these skills, when you can tell that they're using them effectively?
It's very much something you can notice. I can also notice in sessions when people aren't using them. You see kind of this emotional dysregulation that just kind of sits there. Whereas people who do use it, they'll come in and they'll describe the situation of, it started out as that emotional dysregulation, and then walk you through, well, then I kind of did this observe, and then I described what was going on to the person there with me. And then as they're talking about it, you can almost sense them de-escalating even as they're talking about it. And sometimes even them doing the skill gets them to de-escalate, because it also can be kind of a form of distraction sometimes.
What do you notice inside your body when you're using these skills?
For me, the biggest thing I notice is when I go into use observe is everything starts to slow down. Everything it's almost like we're hitting pause. You're able to kind of stop, kind of see what's going on around you, and kind of assess through those five senses just kind of what's going on, and kind of just measuring with yourself. So maybe we notice our breathing has changed. So our senses kind of notice, like, maybe our body temperature's picked up, maybe our heart rate's picked up. That's kind of what I start to notice. Is I get a lot of physical responses that really, really kind of get my attention to notice that something maybe in the moment is kind of off.
Yeah. I notice for myself, like, here's some things that I try to observe. When I get anxious or when I'm feeling some emotional intensity, I might shake my foot.
Okay.
And so I try to observe, like, okay, if I start doing that, what am I feeling?
Mm-hmm.
Or if I'm sitting in the office, which is something I need to do a lot, and do telehealth sessions, for example, I might feel restless at a certain time. And to ask myself, what's going on inside of me that I'm noticing my restlessness?
Certainly. Another thing I notice in myself, like along with that, is if I get kind of frustrated, let's say, I know one of the first things I'm going to do is I'll get really, really quiet.
Oh, that's your tell?
Yes. And it's not that I'm mad in the moment, but it's also kind of me observing in myself in that moment that my frustration level kind of went up. And so that's me kind of stepping back.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what happened there. And sometimes it's noticing my own frustration of just going, well, nothing really happened in the moment. It's just, I heard something maybe I didn't want to hear.
Yeah. For me, I notice too, like, if I'm able to label my emotions instead of just feel the discomfort, what I notice in myself is that it feels like it rises just a little bit, like right when I'm starting to say the name of the emotion. And then afterwards, after giving it a name, I feel like the tension level drops a little bit inside myself. Because I'm like, okay, that's what it is. And in some ways, like, giving it a name robs it of some of its power.
And that's kind of part of what Describe helps do. It gives it a name. It's kind of like we've observed this stuff that's happening, and then once we describe it, it's like, if it's an emotion, then we're labeling it. We're putting a name on it. We're giving it an identity, as opposed to it just sort of sitting out there as just this random emotion. And you're right. When we name it, when we describe it, when we sort of put it out there and say it out loud, it does kind of change how we look at it.
Yeah.
Because I think, like you said, it makes it feel real at that point.
Yeah. So, what might get in the way of using observing and describing?
Well, as I said earlier, with these skills, what's unique about them with observe and describe is we can only do them one at a time. We can't do a lot of things simultaneously. So, some things that can really get in the way of that are if we're multitasking during
Oh,
this, like we
absolutely.
do not want to multitask. You want to be very intentional and you want to notice a few other things. And I kind of jotted down a few things that I've noticed even with clients. Multitasking being one of them. Willfulness is another if they just simply don't want to
Hmm.
observe and describe. Um, Sometimes I've noticed too, if people are past their skills breakdown point, sort of past their threshold, this can be very hard to access until they maybe do something else to kind of get back within that threshold. And that's going to vary from person to person. Other things I notice is like just simply avoidance of those emotions. Maybe they're too much. People just simply avoid them. And then one of the things I noticed too with mindfulness is sometimes for people, it's that inability to focus during mindfulness. And as we've all done it and taught it, mindfulness can be really difficult to learn.
It can. One of the things that I notice in myself and a lot of the people that I sit with is being forgetful.
Oh,
That if
certainly.
this is a goal, I want to do this. I want to get better at noticing my signs that I'm starting to head in a direction I don't want to head, or feel the emotion that I have a hard time coping with, and then I become really ineffective. And as people are, starting to commit to that work, to forget and fall back into the old habit. And I
Yeah.
find that it's really useful for people to figure out what's a way that I can remind myself that using this skill, for example, could help make it better.
Hmm.
So
So,
I don't know. I have this little notepad next to my computer where I sit and I'll write notes to myself sometimes.
mhm.
And just having those reminders like, oh, if I can label my feelings, that helps me figure out how to handle those feelings better. Like those reminders can be really useful because I might have a habit of not using skills at all. And I'm trying to break that habit.
And that's a really good point. Like sometimes what can happen in, as you said, being forgetting is sometimes we do lose sight of just what it is that our goal was in that moment. Um,
Yeah.
and so sometimes that's where we kind of practice with mindfulness and observing to kind of almost, I don't want to say stay on script, but kind of for lack of a better term, that's kind of what we want to do. And it's very easy when we're doing mindfulness that if a thought or something comes in front of us, that we might jump on that thought and forget what we were there to do in the
Yeah.
first place.
So easy to do, right?
Hmm.
Well, how might observing and describing help us make a life worth living?
Well, when I look at it, certain situations, we have those low intensity situations that just kind of get in the way of everyday life. They don't maybe cause significant distress, but they certainly get in the way. And where observing and describe can really help with that, especially if it's like a relationship or something, is I kind of find it can help resolve conflict. It can help improve communication. It also can help the individual just kind of manage those emotions because it gets us to slow down. It gets us to be in the moment and kind of get us when we're feeling emotions to kind of stop and name it and describe it and just essentially to the other person explain what's happening.
Yeah.
And that with high intensity where maybe we're engaging in behaviors where maybe we're putting our life more in danger.
Hmm.
These things can kind of help recenter us, kind of get us to kind of get back to more of a mindful place. And again, it helps us improve communication. It slows that person's thought processes down and it gets them to sort of start identifying emotions. So if they're very elevated, one of the things, especially if we have a coaching call, we're trying to slow that process down and get them to essentially observe and describe to us what their current situation is. So in some senses, we kind of do this with our clients in a pinch. And I've kind of also found a unique thing with this working with clients is that it kind of improves their awareness to their own triggers.
Yeah. I agree. Saying it out loud helps you realize this is exactly what I'm dealing with right now. Putting
Right.
language to it, in some ways, telling the story. And it also kind of functions as a way to pause and stop ourselves in that flow of habit, especially if the habit, like you said, is self destructive or hurts other people or makes it worse in another way, especially when you can't reverse it.
Certainly. And when you're hearing people describing, let's say on a coaching call, all those thoughts, all these things that they have, and quite often it can sound like word vomit on the phone. They're just throwing a lot of things at us. And so sometimes one of the first questions I know I'll ask them is, okay, well, tell me kind of what you're feeling right now. Kind of walk me through what's going on in this moment.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're ignoring those details. It's just like, let's kind of start here and kind of name that emotion. What got us triggered in the first place? And sometimes getting them to walk back to there gets us to kind of start back at step one and kind of get them to kind of tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you said it well, Nate. It gets people to be able to tell the story. Once we're able to tell that story, then we have a direction that we can go. So, we hope that for all of you listening, that this episode helps you understand just a little bit more about observing and describing. While it can take a lifetime to master any skill, with practice, it's going to get progressively easier over time. I hope you experience that too. So we hope that all of you continue doing, being, and thinking in wise ways on your way to making a life worth living. Talk to you next time. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening. Doing, Being, Thinking is an educational podcast about dialectical behavior therapy and is not intended as a substitute for therapy. This is a podcast outreach of Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services, offering both in-person and telehealth therapy to children, teens, and adults throughout Michigan. If you are a Michigan resident and want to get started with therapy, including DBT, children's DBT, or other evidence-based therapies, please contact us at 616-719-0194 or find us on the web at www.adolescentfamilybhs.com.